I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr Ade Oyedijo, who is joining us from the University of Hull. He's a member of academic staff at the department, and it's always great with these events to get an academic perspective where you're actually hearing from potentially someone that is actually going to be giving you the lectures, teaching you on an actual course. And I'm very conscious of these events. You are tuning in to hear from the speaker and not from myself, so I always keep this introduction very brief. So with that, I'll pass the floor now to Ade for an introduction to logistics and supply chain management, please.
Thank you very much, Jon, for that introduction. And it's nice to be able to come on this platform to give some insights about logistics and supply chain management, a subject that I hold very dearly to my heart. And I hope you guys at the end of this session would take one or two things away that would hopefully inform your decision making about studying this subject at university level. So as Jon mentioned earlier, my name is Dr Ade Oyedijo. I'm a lecturer. I'm an assistant professor in logistics and supply chain management at Hull University Business School. I have a bachelor's originally in business and management studies. I went on to do an MSc in logistics and supply chain management. And I also went on to do my PhD in procurement and supply chain management, which is a specialist area on top of my MSc degree. I'm also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK, and I'm a chartered member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply Chain Management. That's one of the professional bodies in logistics and supply chain. I'm a researcher, so I'm active in research that is pertaining to logistics and supply chain management. I do work on different topics within the subject area, from humanitarian logistics. We are all facing a pandemic at the moment. I do work on supply chain, buyer-supplier relationships, the collaboration between partners in that area. I also do some work on supply chain management in developing economies, particularly in West Africa, and how that is different or unique in contrast to or in comparison to the Western world. I'm a consultant. I do consult for businesses, and I'm also a public speaker as well. So you could search for me in your own time if you do want to get some insights about my social media work. Right, so let's go into it very quickly. What do we know about logistics and supply chain management? It is a funny concept, but it is very important. Everything we do involves some form of logistics, some form of operational activity, or some form of supply chain management. It is in the DNA of individuals and businesses. So every business, when we focus on businesses now, every business needs to have some form of moving one good, one material, one item from one point to another. And that becomes very, very important, because as you are aware, we as end consumers, we are always looking forward to that product to be delivered on time, all right? We also look forward to that service to be delivered at the right quality, the right price, the right pace, and the right expectation. And logistics and supply chain management plays a very vital role in ensuring that you and I, as end consumers, are satisfied always, right? So it's in the DNA of every business. As you can see from this picture, there are usually two types of or angles to logistics and supply chain management. We've got the business side, which is, if you look at my slide here, these first two are normally the business type of supply chain, where goods are moved from one point to another to satisfy the end consumer's needs. And then down here, you would see the humanitarian aspect, which normally this type of logistics and supply chain would deal with humanitarian issues, would deal with regions that have been affected by different disasters, such as natural disasters like flooding, hurricanes, tornado, fire. We've got the one going on in the US, in California at the moment. We've got coronavirus, a pandemic that is impacting on different regions. You've got in Beirut 2 weeks ago, we had the big blast, and a supply chain that would help that type of negative event would be a humanitarian supply chain. So this is just to give you some distinctive features to how logistics and supply chain could be different depending on how you look at it. But what is a supply chain? Usually a supply chain would involve direct and indirect activities that would fulfill a customer's request. In the humanitarian supply chain perspective, it would involve activities that would give relief to affected regions, right? So normally it would involve a manufacturer, a supplier, the transporter, wholesalers, retailers, and you and I, the end consumers. We are part of the supply chain, so that becomes very important, and I hope you pay attention to that as we move along. So supply chains usually would consist of the upstream activities, which would usually have, for example, a product. Okay, I'll use this phone as an example. This is a Samsung product, would have an upstream aspect where materials would need to be sourced. So the parts for this phone would be sourced, for example, from China, would be sourced from Korea, whatever, and then they will be packaged in probably Singapore or in Thailand, and then they will be shipped down to the UK. So all those activities are part of the supply and logistical activities that ensure that you and I as end consumers get satisfied. So at the end of the day, it is a system. A supply chain is a system. A supply chain would involve planning, design, manufacturing, distribution, right? When that phone is manufactured, it needs to be distributed. And that's where the logistical aspect comes in, where the items move from one point to another. They need to be distributed, they need to be sold. And today, very important, today we also talk about recycling as well. We talk about the recovery of those items. So if that item gets spoiled or gets damaged and you want to throw away this item, how do you throw it away in a way that is sustainable to the environment, etc.? So that gives you some definition to the concept of supply chain management. Normally with supply chain management, like I said in the last slide, it would have key suppliers that would have a key factor in efficiency and effectiveness, right? You want to ensure that goods are and services are passed on from one point to another in an efficient and effective manner, right? So again, it involves upstream and downstream relationships. To form a supply chain, having a supplier in India, in Thailand, in Bangkok, for example, having another supplier in Greece, one in France, in the UK, you'd have to be able to have some form of relationship to foster, to enable that everything goes smooth and well. Supply chains today are a source of competitive advantage for businesses. A business that gets its supply chain right and develops its supply chain properly would be a business that would grow in performance and in competitiveness. So this particular slide gives us an example of how a supply chain is. So for example, you've got a mill in the USA, right, where the raw materials are processed, and then you've got the production plant in France, you've got a central warehouse in the UK. You can see that that's a warehouse, that's a massive warehouse. You've got a point of replenishment where you need to restock, you need to put items back for inventory purpose. And then you've got the items go to the point of sale, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, etc. And then you've got you and I, the end consumers, go into the store to buy the item. So this is a supply chain in a nutshell, a simple supply chain, a direct supply chain, right? Where you've got a lot of money, people, materials, right? Supply chain needs money, people, and materials for it to work. Very quickly, I'll dash through these slides as quickly as possible. There are disruptions that could influence the efficiency and effectiveness of a supply chain. One, again, like I said earlier, is COVID-19 that is affecting many businesses as we speak. But it is known that 75% of businesses experience at least one disruption in their supply chain, and that runs into millions of US dollars in costs for businesses. this is an example of how a disruption can affect a supply chain. We all experienced this, I think, earlier in March, April time, where we went into retail stores to buy bread, to buy spaghetti, rice, chicken, and we couldn't find, because there was more supply demand for those items than supply, and that's because there was a disruption in the supply chain for those items, and that becomes a very important issue for we end consumers and for businesses as well, right? So these are some of the key issues, particularly in relation to an event that is affecting all of us at the moment, COVID-19. There are technical gaps and business skills in terms of a challenge for businesses. There's a need for more investment. There's also probably the need for accessing finance for businesses as well. So what are the challenges that businesses face, particularly with regards to supply chain and logistics management? When COVID-19 happened, there was closure of borders. If borders are closed, businesses can't transport goods from one point to another like they would normally. Sourcing, the availability of suppliers, some suppliers were short because of COVID-19, and that impacted on the ability to get materials that would satisfy you and I, the end consumers. Inventory management, there was no stock, low levels of stock. Transportation capacity, some airports were short, some ports were not operating to their full capacity, and so on. Again, lack of information or information failures, human resource, people were not going to work, and that affected, again, the efficiency of supply chains. Supply chains require people to function. Guess what? All this that I've mentioned so far are related to logistics and supply chain management. And you can see from this slide, you can see how, like I mentioned earlier, a company could be in Japan, have suppliers in India. That company in India could have its suppliers in Egypt. This is Egypt. That company in Egypt could have its suppliers in south of Spain, and that could, so it's an interconnected world in terms of supply chains. Some recent cases of why logistics and supply chain is important, particularly in relation to COVID-19. You saw the likes of Primark losing so much money because of COVID-19. We saw H&M, Nando's, McDonald's as well. These are recent cases to show you the value of this particular subject area for industry. Again, you see the likes of Nissan shutting down factories, Aston Martin as well being affected by this issue. Now, I've given you the story or some literature regarding this particular subject. Now, let's look at it from how does it link to your career path in terms of studying this at university level. Why logistics and supply chain management at university level? What are the key reasons? It's a growing industry, right? Logistics and supply chain management is a growing field. So there will always be need for people in logistics and supply chain management. There are increasing benefits, high levels of job satisfaction. There's a variety of requirements because of the specialty of logistics and supply chain. Even though you're a logistics professional, you could be an inventory management specialist, you could be a resource planner, you could be a materials demand executive. There's so many variety of requirements within logistics and supply chain management. So when you're studying logistics and supply chain management, you're not just going to be a truck driver or just a logistics and supply chain management specialist only. There's so many other elements within this area that you could go into, which makes it a very varied area to study. There are prospects for career growth as well. This is a very growing industry, and there's a gender diversity in this industry. From the angle of heavy machinery, supply chains and logistics would always have warehouses, and then looking at it from transportation, logistics, flying goods from one point to another, etc. Right. So these are some of the key reasons why this area is very important or very interesting. There are two main bodies in the field of logistics and supply chain management in the UK. There's a Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and there's a Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Again, these are some of the industries that you could go into, manufacturing industry, and you could also go into services industry as well. when we talk about logistics and supply chain management, you don't necessarily have to work in a warehouse, or you don't necessarily have to work in a manufacturing facility. There are so many businesses, banking sector, IT businesses that are needing supply chain professionals as well. And these are some of the examples of businesses always requiring professionals in this field. Again, there's most universities offering logistics and supply chain management courses should have some form of industrial partnership with businesses that could enable you as a student studying this course to do some form of placement or industrial visits, etc. We've got the likes of Sainsbury's, Nestle, DHL, etc. So this is an example of the degree structure, right? This is not applicable to every single university, but this is an example of a structure. In the first year, you would probably do generic courses like accounting and finance. Even though you're a logistics and supply chain professional, you should still be able to understand different business and management courses like accounting and finance, like marketing. You need to be good in finance. You need to have some knowledge of money to be able to be a professional in supply chain management. You need to be able to have an understanding of business environment, have some professional skills, etc. So these are some of the courses you would do in your first year. In your second year, you'd go more probably into the subject. So procurement and supply chain, information, managing big data. Information is important to connect the supply chain properly. And then we are all talking about the need for ethics, the need for socially responsible supply chains today, and you could also study that in university. So these are some of the optional modules that you might take as well. A good supply chain and logistics professional should be able to do some research about their partners, about their prospective partners, done some research about how to develop their supply chain, and most universities should offer some research methods modules in that effect. In the final year, these are some of the courses that you could also do. You could do some consultancy project modules, supply chain network design modules, port management, etc. So this is a case of my own current university. So how will you learn? How will you learn? Most universities would have lectures. You would have a big lecture theater. The lecturer would stand in front of you to deliver a lecture to you, to deliver a lecture on a topic. So the first lecture on my module would be, for my final year students, would be an introduction to supply chain sustainability. In that lecture, I will really explain what sustainability means for supply chains, etc. So that's a lecture. After that, you would then have tutorials or workshops or seminars, we call it, where that seminar, that tutorial is feeding back on the lecture that was delivered earlier. So that tutorial would ensure that you really understand what was delivered in the lecture. You would have different activities, different interesting activities to inform your knowledge in a deeper level towards the topic that was delivered in the lecture. Again, sometimes we'd have different games, business games, case studies. You would normally work in a group, right? So be prepared to work in a group. You would work in a group with different teams to solve a problem. This is very important because as logistics and supply chain professionals, you should ensure you will be needing to solve problems. And you can't solve problems alone. If you're working in a company, your line manager, the director might put you in a group of 5 people with different people you don't even know sometimes, and you'd have to work to solve a problem. And most universities will do that for you, or would include these activities in your approaches to learning. Again, there are different field trips. You might be going to a specific company to see how things are done from a logistics and supply chain management point of view. Again, how are you going to be assessed? You're going to be assessed by projects, reports, exams, group presentations. So you might have a 30 minutes group presentation, 5 of you in a group. Each person would present for 5 minutes on the subject, on a topic that you have researched about for probably 2-3 months prior to the presentation, individual essays, etc. Now, what are the prospects for if you study logistics and supply chain management. You could be a supply chain manager, you could be a procurement manager, you could be a logistics manager. A supply chain manager is an individual that manages the supply chain, manages the supplier, manages the buyers of your company. A procurement manager usually would be in charge of the procurement aspect. How do you source for materials that would enable you manufacture that product? A logistics manager usually deals with the movement of those goods that have been manufactured from one point to another, right? You could also be a project manager. There are several projects within logistics and supply chains that you could work on. You could be a customer demand planner. You could work with different variety of companies. So there's so much career prospects for you if you study this degree. And to round off, logistics is a crucial factor for businesses. Every business needs a logistics professional. Every business, we see the likes of Amazon today, who are constantly expanding business from a logistical and supply chain management perspective. And this gives you some idea about how this course is very important to study. You also have the likes of Bosch, Royal Mail in the UK, Rolls-Royce, DHL, UPS, FedEx, always looking for professionals in this area. And there's also a lot of, prospects for you. There is a good pay as well. So this is a real advantage for you if you wanted to go into the graduate market. And this ends my presentation. I hope you were able to gain some insights with regards to the subject, logistics and supply chain management, as I started at the beginning. I then moved on to what are some of the ways of studying this at university in terms of the courses, different modules, and I went on to give you some insights with regards to the career. I hope that was helpful, and thank you very much for listening.